This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris sitting in this week. Shane, great to have you back on the program with me.
John, I consider it a very great sign that you keep having me on here. It means I haven't offended too many of our listeners yet.
Oh, you have. We just haven't passed on those emails to you. So but I like the way that you kind of, intentionally come up with a new way to say thank you each time. That really means a lot to me, that sort of intentionality and dedication to the job. Look, a lot of stories to get to this week. I want to start with one that was a beautiful and pleasant surprise. And I want to talk about how it's beautiful mostly, but here's the pleasant surprise. What could possibly draw the attention across major media outlets and all of social media away from the current political craziness of the impeachment inquiry and everything related to it? What could possibly have changed that? Well, I got off a plane on Wednesday night from Seattle to Dallas and was pleasantly surprised that something had changed the headlines. And it was something that's really one of the most beautiful stories that I've seen in a long time. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it was astonishing, and it evokes stories in months prior, years prior. I thought especially of the Emmanuel AME church shooting and the supernatural forgiveness. I don't know how else to describe it. The supernatural forgiveness that the members of that church offered to the shooter in court, and other things like that. This was the case we're talking about. Is Amber Guyton was a police officer who, for whatever reason, entered the apartment of a guy named Brandt Jean and believed it was her apartment, according to her testimony, and killed him. She drew her weapon and shot him. And she was tried for murder and convicted and then sentenced to 10 years in prison. And in the course of the proceedings, Jean's 18-year-old brother, Brandt, got the chance to offer a victim impact statement. And, he addressed the court and Guyton directly. And what he did was extraordinary. He offered her forgiveness. He said, "I love you as a person. I don't wish anything bad on you. I don't know if this is possible, but can I give her a hug?" And at this point, he asked the judge, and the judge said yes. And he goes over and gives her a hug. And then the judge, on top of this, goes back to grab her personal Bible from her chambers and gives it to Guyton and tells her, "You start with this," and then evidently was praying for her. This was it was a witness to the Christian gospel in the midst of a civil proceeding and in the execution of justice. It was astonishing.
It was astonishing. And look, again, I was looking for anything, that could bring something better to the headlines. And it wasn't just anything. It was literally a portrayal and articulation of the gospel that dominated social media and major news outlets for about 24 hours. It was stunning. He literally said to her, the best would be to give your life to Christ. That's what Botham would want you to do. He said he loved her. It was just incredible. And look, you said something just a minute ago that I want to come back to, Shane, which is that it was astonishing. And I think it's astonishing on a number of levels. We live in a time where forgiveness is not offered. In fact, usually we don't even give somebody a presumption of innocence before we condemn them in so many ways if they're on, the other side from us ideologically or in some situation. And there's not possibly another side to be on that's more distinct than when you take the life of someone's family member. That's what happened. And yet that's what this young man did. And he did it. And it seemed like the rest of his family maybe wasn't comfortable with him doing that. He did it. He said, "I'm speaking for myself, not for anyone else." And he's since actually taken some flack from some folks who said that it wasn't the right thing to do. And I think this is something that we should expect should be shocking. I mean, where else are you going to get this sort of grounding for this activity other than Christianity? Where else are you going to find forgiveness? I've thought about this a lot, Shane. I'd love to know what you think here about this, but you don't just have things in a culture out of nowhere. They've got to be grounded in something. And there are some cultures that excel in areas of mercy and grace and second chances. Ours isn't one of those, right? Ours either basically you could be condemned for life for something you tweeted when you were 12, on one hand, or you can be completely dismissed in the name of sexual freedom from any sort of bad behavior on the other side. But the idea of acknowledging wrongdoing and then offering forgiveness, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of resources left in our culture for that kind of behavior, other than Christianity.
Well, the elephant in the room in this particular case, and I don't think we've mentioned it, is that Geiger is a white former police officer. Jean and his brother are black. And you have a racial component brought into this, and it sort of evokes the whole issue about police brutality that's been brewing for the last few years and the accusations of racism that underlie that. And as in the case of the Emmanuel AME church shooting, where the members of that congregation were willing to come forward and forgive this mass murderer, although he did not, as Geiger apparently has, show any sort of remorse, then as of now there were commentators who couldn't understand that kind of forgiveness. And there were even some who treated it as sort of a cheap grace or kind of racial subservience. It reminded me of in Laura Waters Henson's documentary about the Rwandan genocide called As We Forgive. There's this line in there where a pastor says, "This is not human, it's divine." And you know what? I think he's right. There's something in the kind of forgiveness we see offered in moments like this, moments of horrific, monstrous wrongdoing, that's overcome through the gospel, I think is seen by those without a Christian view of sin and the cross and salvation as foolishness. It boggles their minds. It's like Jesus said, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible.
Yeah, I want to let that sit there for a second, because that's just exactly what we saw. I do think it's amazing that we have seen more than one story, and this was just remarkable, but more than one story of forgiveness in news items in recent memory, and they have to do with Christianity, because that's what Christianity does. And I understand those that are having trouble understanding it, because this is kind of foolishness to the Greeks in one sense. And, you're talking about a community coming from a deep place of hurt, and you're talking about a community that then a narrative that was high, certainly hoisted upon this particular story. And there's so many strange things about this story. Many people want to know, how do you not know you're in the wrong apartment? And why do you resort to that? And it's 2 a.m. and you're talking about a woman who feels unsafe and she's completely wrong. And it just seems like a perfect storm of crazy and mistakes of living in a fallen world. It's just so hard to get your head around how something like this could happen. And what is the only answer? The only answer is a divine one. And I want to let that sit there, because I think that's a really important point to be made. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. If you have not seen that, come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to this remarkable video of this act of forgiveness that took over media. And I think that that's what happens when, again, something supernatural takes place, which we witnessed in that Dallas courtroom on Wednesday. Well, again, Breakpoint This Week here. John Stonestreet along with Shane Morris. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, back on Breakpoint This Week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Again, if you want to follow us, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. We put out Breakpoint each and every day on the Breakpoint podcast, as well as Breakpoint This Week, which you're listening to right now, and some other programs, long-form commentaries, interviews, things like that. And again, anywhere you get your podcast, just look up the Breakpoint podcast, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever. And of course, you can always find us at breakpoint.org. Shane, I want to come back to a story we've been talking about for weeks. It's got a distinctly Christian character to it as well, although in a very different sort of way than the story that we just discussed. And that is what's happening in these extended protests in Hong Kong. Protests that have been, in a sense, for as long as they've been going on, for as heated as they are, dealing with the sorts of state that you're dealing with, in many ways has avoided a level of violence that it could have hit. But there certainly have been moments of violence, and I think there's probably a way in which patience is growing thin on behalf of mainland China.
Yeah, I don't think I can think of a clearer example in our time of the clash of worldviews cashed out practically than what's going on in Hong Kong. I mean, here you have a Chinese territory filled with Chinese people profoundly influenced by Western political values and Christianity, and they're manifesting and trying to hold on to that heritage. It's what they want. It's what's made them prosperous and so valuable to the mother country. But China is committed to something else. They're committed to an ideology of communism, which views much of what makes Hong Kong unique a major threat. So that's the background of what's going on right now and the conflict that's continually roiling in Hong Kong, which historically has been a very peaceful and tranquil place. You know, China, remember, is in the midst of a massive crackdown on religious minorities and dissenters everywhere, from Muslims and Christians to, you know, the house church movement. There are even reports that they're trying to modify Chinese Bibles to sort of excise parts that could be seen as anti-communist or pro-democracy. You know, the original extradition bill that sparked these Hong Kong protests and riots over the past 4 months, and I say that because there have been violent actions by the protesters that, you know, we would be right to condemn, but much of it has been a peaceful action. And this was 4 months ago that this began. That bill has been withdrawn, but the protesters now seem to have sort of something else in mind. They want greater autonomy. They see the crackdown by Hong Kong police as a manifestation of Chinese communist control. They see China as failing to uphold their end of the bargain from the one nation, two systems agreement that sort of characterized the handover from Great Britain.
Yeah, and they have, and there's impatience of waiting the 50 years that they're supposed to wait out, of Hong Kong's kind of independence, of running in a little bit of a different way. And I think they realize too that this will be a situation that will be extremely hard on people of faith, and that's certainly something that we've seen in mainland China. And, you mentioned the crackdowns. I mean, we're seeing just unbelievable stories, not just against Christians, but certainly against Muslims, Muslim Uyghurs, for example, forced taking of organ harvesting from some of these religious minorities. I mean, it's just kind of, beleaguers imagination to think how far this is actually going. And, one of the things that's going to be a consequence of this, and I think we've got to start talking about it now, and we've got to continue to talk about it. We have tried from the very beginning is to basically acknowledge where this administration has done well, and also be willing to say, this is a place where this administration has not done well. And one of our areas of critique have had to do with religious refugees. In particular, this administration has expressed concern for persecuted Christians, but the numbers of refugees accepted into the U.S. has plummeted to almost nothing. And what we're going to have, the more crackdowns that we see across mainland China, and certainly if it happens in Hong Kong as well, is we're going to see some of these refugees coming from China. We know how vibrant the church is in many areas. We know how persecuted the church can be. And of course, it's not just there, but it's everywhere. But it just underscores this question: is America going to be a place where refugees can find haven, where we will welcome those who are facing persecution in their native lands? And it's important to say again that in the campaigning season of 2016, both the president and the vice president actually said that this was going to be a characteristic of the administration, was caring for especially persecuted Christians. That's something that we've seen to some degree in terms of the international meetings on religious liberty, certainly naming Sam Brownback as the ambassador at large for international religious liberty. These are important things. We're going to have to figure out the refugee issue as well.
Yeah, with the China situation, you've got, it's a uniquely discouraging situation, because I don't see, looking back on the history of another communist power, the Soviet Union, I don't see China as teetering on the brink of collapse. I don't see it as a place where a Pope John Paul II or a Ronald Reagan could come and sort of apply pressure, and there be an openness within the leadership of the country to actually reform their system. I don't see that. I see China as ramping up their control now ideologically over their people, and Hong Kong seems to be a key part of that project. And so you have this clash between people who are committed to democracy and historically very Christian as well. We mentioned on a prior breakpoint this week that Christian hymns have figured prominently in some of these pro-democracy protests. And so it seems like a rock and a hard place. It's like, how does this end without one side being completely squashed or violence taking place? And I don't know if that means taking in refugees from China in particular, but yeah, it's a puzzling and confusing and difficult situation. I think what needs to happen is China has to stand down and let Hong Kong be Hong Kong. it's not fair to renege their agreement like this.
Well, no, it's not fair. But the cult of personality around Xi Jinping, and the elevation of even in some of the reports, as you mentioned, have to do with cutting parts out of the Bible. Other reports have to do with basically swearing allegiance to Xi Jinping in schools and so on, and especially having children report on their parents if they attend religious services. I mean, this is things that we saw during Mao's time that are being resurrected and revisited, and there's no good direction that this can go. In the long run. And I think that's what the Hong Kong protesters, many of whom are serious about their faith, are seeing, and they're rightly concerned about it. I also want to update our folks, though, on another story that we've talked about before. This has to do with an abortionist in South Bend, Indiana, Dr. Ulrich Klaffer, who died on September the 3rd. But he ran an abortion clinic that was eventually shut down because he failed to meet the regulations, which, by the way, let's be honest, Shane, is saying a lot, because regulations around the abortion industry are pretty thin and rarely enforced. But anyway, he operated 3 clinics in South Bend, Fort Wayne, and Gary, Indiana. And he passed away again just a few weeks ago. And law enforcement officials found over 2,200 medically preserved aborted fetuses in his Illinois home. He lived in Illinois, ran these clinics in Indiana. And there's some details that continue to be, that's bizarre and sick and disturbing as it is, but it seems to even get more bizarre. And this is something that I said a couple weeks ago when we talked about it, I think, with Warren, which is there's more details coming out of this story. And I don't want to make a prediction about where this is going, but this is going to be a Gosnell sort of situation. And it seems like what we're seeing is reinforcing that prediction.
Yeah, well, the comparison to Gosnell is exactly right. Let me head off an objection that I think that a pro-choice listener, if we have any of those, might actually raise. And they might say, well, this is nitpicking. This is not how the pro-choice movement and the abortion industry runs by and large. There are 3 reasons why I think, highlighting this sort of case and the Gosnell sort of case isn't nitpicking. These sort of crazy, gruesome abortion doctors who keep jars of fetal parts in their offices and homes. The first is that Planned Parenthood videos that surfaced a few years back, for which David Dallatin is still in a great deal of legal trouble. We saw proof that the nation's largest abortion provider is doing something even more shocking and disgusting than the fact of abortion itself. They're selling body parts, bypassing all kinds of rules. They're joking about it. They're modifying their procedures to get better organs, and they're talking about needing new Lamborghinis in the process. And then, of course, they're helping women who are posing as underage prostitutes get abortions. So this isn't fringe. It's a mainstream movement. The second thing is, I think these kinds of stories expose the grisly reality of what abortion really is. Ross Douthat had this amazing line where he said that you can think abortion doesn't kill a human being all you want, but you can't deny that it results in a corpse. You can't look at those body parts in jars of formaldehyde and freezer bags and say, no, those aren't human. And if you do, we're sort of in the territory of who are you going to believe, the Guttmacher Institute or your lying eyes? And then the last reason why I think these so-called extreme cases or these nutty or freaky corpse collectors aren't nitpicking, it's not unfair to bring them up, is that Kermit Gosnell and this other body collector, they're precisely the consequences of decades of local officials and state officials turning a blind eye to this practice and saying, I don't want to know what's going on in that clinic. I don't want to interfere with a woman's right to choose. And the same thing applies in this case. In fact, the laws that resulted in the guy getting shut down and his house of horrors being discovered, those are precisely the sorts of laws that pro-lifers are proposing, and abortion defenders fight tooth and nail as interfering with women's rights. So no, this is not, it's not unfair for us to deal with this case or to hold it up as an example of what the abortion industry is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. You're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to articles and resources about the stories that we've talked about. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, our featured resource this month has to do with religious freedom, something we talk about a lot. And I know what some of our listeners are thinking. It's like, well, why do you spend so much time talking about that? And one of the reasons is because, this is one of the hot issues in our culture. And it's also something that most Christians, I think, don't know and maybe don't even realize they need to know how to talk about. It was the case not that long ago where religious freedom was universally assumed to be a good, and that was a non-controversial position to take, whether you're on the right or the left. Today, increasingly, religious freedom is seen along the lines of something like a license to discriminate. And even this week, and by the way, that's why our featured resource is a book called Free to Believe by Luke Goodrich. It's a terrific book. Luke is a Becket attorney. He was the lead attorney on the Hobby Lobby case, which was an enormously important case for religious liberty. And Becket is one of the great religious freedom or defense organizations that are out there. And Luke's book is simply fantastic. You need to know, like, how do I make this case? How do I talk to my kids about it? How do I talk to my neighbors about it? This is the book. And even this week, there were 3 stories in 3 states. And that underscores something that we've talked about before, which is we think about these battles over life and marriage and religious liberty to be national ones. They're not. They're local ones first, and before they're national ones. And we had a story in Michigan, story in Florida, and story in Iowa, and all reflecting kind of different directions on the issue of religious liberty. Out of Michigan, though, it's really good news because faith-based foster and adoption agencies have really been under fire, facing a challenge by the state, which basically says, if you do not fully affirm and will place children in homes, LGBT homes, then you can't even, stay in this business. And U.S. District Judge Robert Jonker ruled that the state regulation that requires faith-based agencies to place children with unmarried or same-sex couples was an unfair targeting of the agency's religious beliefs. So he temporarily blocked the rule, and the arguments are going to proceed. This is probably one that we could see at the Supreme Court, not guaranteed yet. But this is a big deal. It's a big deal for a couple reasons, Shane. One is that those faith-based agencies, particularly Catholic Charities in Lansing, Michigan, who said, you know what, we're not going to cave on this. This is a vindication because actually there were some faith-based agencies that changed their mind on this and changed their practice on this. And I think that this is a good lesson that, you know what, again, we call it a theology of getting fired. When do you have to make that decision to move forward? It's a hard one when you're talking about helping kids and not being able to help kids if you don't and all that sort of stuff. But I think the decision by Catholic Charities here is vindicated.
Yeah, this is the exact same sort of situation Catholic Charities faced in Massachusetts back in 2006, which was one of the first big religious casualties of legal same-sex marriage. And the basic takeaway is, look, when you have competing definitions of what the family are, and one is enshrined in law, you really have 2 options. Either you can arrange some sort of toleration or pluralistic solution where you allow religious organizations like this to continue to operate according to their definition of family and marriage, or you can squash them. You can force them to choose between their convictions and closing their doors. And I think groups like ADF and the Becket Fund have argued very convincingly and successfully in many cases that it's better for society as a whole if we allow religious charities like this to keep doing their thing. This was similar to the Little Sisters of the Poor case, which made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The fundamental question here is, can America, governed as it is now by a new and different conception of rights and family, can we still make room for the old conception? Or do we have to declare war on Christians? In Colorado or California or Massachusetts or Michigan, the answer has often been no. But this is a ray of good news. It's another victory that will carve out space for dissenters from the new orthodoxy.
Yeah, and then the stories of this week, which is don't give up just yet, and don't snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. The story out of Iowa, huge story here. InterVarsity Christian Fellowship vindicated by U.S. District Judge Stephanie Rose, who ruled that InterVarsity deserves the same First Amendment freedoms. Basically, the University of Iowa was saying that the InterVarsity couldn't exist because they selected only Christians for its own leadership positions, and Iowa said that violated their human rights policy. But as the judge basically found, the university was not receiving these First Amendment protections, while other on-campus groups that restricted who could lead them, including fraternity, sororities, and an LGBT group, surprise, different rules apply, they were allowed to select their own leadership. But this was interesting because apparently she's actually made several school administrators pay out of their own pockets for any damages that were awarded to InterVarsity. That is, I think, what we call making a statement. Another quick story. We're running out of time here, Shane, but also a story out of Florida. U.S. District Court Myron Thompson ruled that Coral Ridge Ministries cannot receive damages against the Southern Poverty Law Center, who identified them as a hate group. They were claiming that having that label had prevented them from receiving some donations, and so that actually did not go the way of the Christian group. That's a tough case, and there's a lot more to be said, and we don't even have time to jump into it without doing damage to it. But the point I want to make is, look, religious freedom matters, and you need to know how to talk about religious freedom, and most Christians aren't ready. So listen, for any gift to the Colson Center this month, we'll send you a copy of Free to Believe by Luke Goodrich. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll tell you there how to get a copy of this terrific book by Luke Goodrich called Free to Believe. Shane, great to have you on again on Breakpoint this week. And for Shane, I'm John Stonestreet. We'll talk to you next time.